Thank you all for coming, and those of you who are joining us from Beirut and around the world. Thank you very much for all of the AUB staff, Ada Porter and Allison, and all of their colleagues for making all this happen. I think you've set in motion something exciting. And today's topic is exciting and timely and a little bit troubling in many ways. For me as a journalist, I've spent 50 years in journalism. I started in 1967. My career has been in the United States, Europe, and the Arab world and the Middle East. I've constantly gone back and forth across these three cultures, always working in English language journalism. And there are a lot of points that we can talk about, but I want to just raise one or two and link them to the current coverage of the situation in Jerusalem after the American government recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital. And also I want to talk a little bit about the initial findings from the research I've done in the last year on the personal papers of the late Anthony Shadid, who was, to my mind, certainly the greatest American foreign correspondent in the Middle East in my generation. There have been a lot of great ones, including David and others, but Anthony was special. He was unique, and that has been recognized by his peers while he was alive and after his death. And I've had the privilege of studying his personal papers at the AUB Library in a project that is headed by myself and May Farah and Elkan Shbaro at the AUB Archives. And we're getting some really fascinating insights, which I'll share with you, which have a direct link on what we're talking about. How do the American correspondents, the Western media as a whole, cover the Middle East or the Arab world in general? So I would basically make one point only about the immediate coverage of the Jerusalem issue by the American media in particular, which I can follow closely because I'm here in the United States now. And it perpetuates the problems that I've seen in the last 50 years of my career, which is a tendency by the media, even the quality media, to focus on one or two dramatic dimensions of the situation, whatever it may be, without sufficiently giving deep context to why these things are happening. So the great example now, of course, is the coverage of Jerusalem. And it started immediately as Trump was making his speech the other day. The media started talking about, is there going to be violence? Is there going to be another intifada? And of course, that's what the coverage is focused on. People in the streets and tear gas and this and that, without sufficiently explaining why this is going on. Now, when this same thing happened in Ferguson or in Baltimore, the American media did go beyond the violence and explain why it was happening. It did go talk to the local people who were in the streets, as well as the policemen and the politicians. It did provide representatives of the demonstrators, mostly African American and other people on the streets in Ferguson or Baltimore or other places. They were able to present their views on television themselves. This doesn't happen very much. It happens rarely, but not much, when it's dealing with coverage of Palestinians, Arabs, and other people in situations like this. So there are exceptions, of course. There's some outstanding journalism done in the United States by mainstream media and by other media, but it's episodic, whereas the rule is to avoid the context and to focus only on the violence without understanding the total picture. So when I was interviewed several times in the last couple of days on American and European media, the first question they asked me, is there going to be more violence? I said, well, we've had violence already. It started with Trump's speech, which was a violent episode. And it was provocative and it was intellectually violent. And that's what you have to start with. And then you look at the reaction, and then you look at both societies. Why did he say what he did? Why did people react as they did? Give a complete picture. So that takes me to the couple of points I want to make about Anthony Shadid's research that we've uncovered. I've interviewed 50 of his colleagues around the world who work with him as editors and colleagues and reporters. I've read about 350 of his articles and his books, and I've gone through all his personal papers, which are fascinating and give us incredible insights into why he was so successful. And the lessons to this issue of how the Western and American media cover the Arab world are really very relevant and very timely. And here's a couple of sort of bullet points that I would make. The first thing is that the real value of Anthony's work was in allowing the voices of those people on the ground, it happened to be Arabs in the Middle East mostly, but also Turks and Israelis and Iranians and Afghans and others that he covered, but mostly he was covering Iraq and Lebanon and Palestine and the Arab world. But he allowed the voices of those people to be heard in a way that they're not sufficiently heard in mainstream news coverage. He also rigorously gave both sides of the story. So, for instance, in the Iraq War, his stories would include what the American army was saying or what American government officials in Washington were saying, and then he would give you the people's voices from the street in Iraq or in Fallujah, wherever it may be. So he was very careful to follow the best American journalistic values, which I learned in college when I went to Syracuse University here in the United States, to be balanced as much as you can. Give both sides, give the whole story, and then let the reader decide whatever the reader wants to decide. So he did that in a way that you don't sufficiently get, I think, across the board. Second of all, he gave the perspectives of the power structure, governments, political elite, rich business people, whatever, and again, ordinary people in the street. And when I say ordinary people, what made his work so fascinating to me, and I think has lessons for us, is that he didn't necessarily go and pick out people that were necessarily representative of certain groups. So, for instance, he wouldn't necessarily go and pick out a local human rights activist or a local protester who's leading a march. He would just walk into a cafe or walk into a bakery shop and start talking to people, say, what do you think about what's going on? And he'd ask them, what do you think? He didn't ask them, what do you think is your government's view? What do you think? So the lesson there is that he genuinely, in his personality and in his reporting, he genuinely showed that he cared about what an ordinary person felt. This doesn't come through very much in the mainstream media. We get government views, we get analyst views, we get professors' views, all of which are good, but we don't sufficiently get the deeper sentiments of ordinary people. And why is that important? It's because, as we've seen in the last 20 years in particular, governments are no longer the only people who determine the fate of our societies. So you look at Iraq, you look at Syria, you look at Lebanon, you look at Palestine, you look at Yemen, Libya, Egypt, all of these countries, governments are still powerful, but they're not all powerful like they used to. The sentiments of ordinary people now count because ordinary people ultimately, when they get together, will shape or influence political developments in their country. And that's one reason why it's important to understand what ordinary people feel. And this is one of the lessons I think we get from Anthony's legacy. Another interesting aspect of this, which is again done sometimes by other reporters and television crews, that they do this once in a while, but not consistently, not enough in my view. They show us that the views of these ordinary people two things are important about that. The views of these ordinary people are, first of all, very nuanced. That there isn't, people call me up sometimes and say, what do the Arabs think of Trump? I say, well, you tell me, what does the Republican Party think of Trump? Well, there's a whole range of views. What do the American people think of Trump? There's a wide range of views. So in the Arab world, it's the same. There's a whole range of views, of different views. So there are nuances in what people think across our region. And the nuances are shaped by political, economic, social, ethnic, many different issues, just as they are in any country in the world. So he was able to catch that, I think, in a way that's very important. The second, more important point, possibly, is that he showed that the views of ordinary people, while they matter, while they are nuanced, are also not particularly unique, in the sense that what ordinary Arabs feel is exactly what most ordinary Americans or Europeans or Japanese feel. In other words, the range of sentiments that people have and the driving forces of those sentiments are absolutely universal. So if you could read Anthony's articles and you go and read the coverage of Ferguson, and you're going to find virtually identical human responses to predicaments of poverty, inequality, perceptions of oppression, police brutality, occupation, colonialism, exploitation. Basically, when human dignity is shattered, people respond in a certain way. And human beings all over the world respond in actually the same way. There's a universal humanity to how people respond to their predicament in situations of occupation or oppression or discomfort. And this is, I think, one of the important lessons that we get, the universality of the different views among ordinary Arab people. In other words, we're not so different. Actually, and this is my experience, having spent my whole life between the United States and Europe and the Arab world. This is something I encounter every day. And it's not just Arabs, it's Israelis, it's Turks, it's Iranians. So these are just a few of the points that I'm starting to identify in the research we're doing, and mainly what I'm focusing on is how did Anthony do this research and reporting and organizing? How did he decide to cover a story? How did he do the reporting on the ground? And there are many interesting techniques which I'm developing in a little manual that we're teaching in a course now at AUB, which is being offered this spring, and gives insights into the craft, I'm calling it the craft of the legacy of Anthony Shadid, in this kind of reporting, which blends hard news reporting with feature-ish reporting and uses the techniques of what's called narrative journalism, or narrative writing, or creative nonfiction writing, or even in some cases a novelist, people who write novel like David and others. So what Anthony did is bring these techniques into the world of daily news reporting, particularly in a foreign context, particularly in a war situation or an occupation situation. That's what really made his work so unique. But my work has been to try to disaggregate all that by interviewing all these people, reading his work, analyzing it, and then putting it all back together in this little manual that will be using for courses at AUB, and hopefully we'll offer that here in the United States in short course form and other things as well. Now, the important thing about this, finally, I would say, is that Anthony couldn't do this on his own. He needed the support of his editors. And this is a critical point, that people at the Boston Globe first, and then the Washington Post, where he did most of his great writing, and then at the New York Times at the end of his career, his editors let him do this. They recognized that this is actually something useful, first for the paper itself, and it created great, he got awards, and the papers were acknowledged as doing something really useful, but more importantly, for the readers, for the readership, for the audience. The editors loved this stuff, and the audience loved it. People learned a lot from it. So this is a win-win situation for the public, for the journalism profession, and for the individual editors and writers who do this. So I think there's some lessons in that as well, in terms of how the media should cover international affairs. And you have a situation now, in a particular issue of American coverage of the Arab world, or the wider Middle East, if you include Turkey, Iran, Israel. American coverage of the Middle East should take note of some of these issues, because you've got active wars going on with American troops fighting and drones killing and satellites refueling Saudi planes in Yemen by the US, and all kinds of active military engagements, now coupled with Trump's statement on Jerusalem, which is creating great anger in the Arab world. So to understand this complex situation, we need this kind of approach that adequately touches the core human sentiments of people, but links it also to the policy issues that are floating around, whether Western governments, Arab governments, other Middle Eastern governments, to have that totality of coverage, the human as well as the policy oriented coverage, is more critical than ever, I would argue. These are a few of the key points that I wanted to make to get us started, and thank you very much.
And we'll go to David now, and I will say that he is a prize-winning Washington Post columnist, a former Wall Street Journal Middle East correspondent, and International Herald Tribune executive editor. And he's also a novelist, and I have right here a shameless plug for his most recent book, which you can see how far I am. I'm to the point where I'd like you all to go away so I could keep reading. I have about a third left. I'm at that point. But thank you for being with us, and we turn it over to you.
Thank you, Allison. We authors love shameless plugs. Too shameless. So I want to take up the challenge that Rami, my old friend for more than 35 years, has set, and try to talk about what good coverage of the Middle East is for American journalists, and what needs to be improved, with special attention to the situation now, as the Palestinians are struggling to deal with the Trump administration's announcement. And just to start with two shorthand bullet points, what we need, as Rami said, is first context. People need to understand what underlies the policy issue. Why does it matter whether the United States recognizes Israel's longstanding declaration that Jerusalem is its capital? Why does it matter if we move the embassy? What's at stake there? What underlie the feelings that people have? And second, we need more intensity in coverage. The numbers of correspondents, TV crews, the infrastructure of journalism in the Middle East is way below what it was when I covered the region, and way below what it needs to be. You simply can't do this job in a powerful way without more resources. So with that opening, I want to talk a little bit about Anthony Shadid, because he was my colleague. I worked with him at the Washington Post. I admired him, grieved for him, his family, his passing. Just say a little about what made him so special, as I observed him. The first thing that you probably wouldn't think is that he was a meticulous craftsman. I would sometimes, when I was going to Baghdad in the 2003-2004 period, stay in Anthony's room at our villa. Anthony would be away on a reporting assignment, and I'll never forget the way in which the sharpened pencils were lined up just so, and the stapler and the erasers and the notebooks. And this was an organized person who had learned the basics of his craft. And I thought, whatever else you say about Anthony, he was a poet and an artist. It began with that mastery of the basic tools. The second thing that I saw in him was that he was able to break out of a tendency we have in journalism to cover the world as if it's a sports event. We all know that experience where somebody will get up and say, so it was a good day today for Donald Trump, as he announced, and Mahmoud Abbas had a rough week, and it's as if it's a sports event. You're going to count up the runs, and that's how you're going to cover it. And Anthony understood that whole approach, the idea of covering what somebody said yesterday in a public forum, as if that's the essence of the story, was a mistake, and that you needed to go to the deeper reality of the story. One way to put it is that he was prepared to ignore the advice of his desk. I was a foreign editor of the Washington Post once, and our very best correspondents learned to ignore my advice and anybody else's. David Remnick was one of my Moscow correspondents. And David did what he damn well pleased. He's one of the greatest journalists in the world, but I remember when he was a young man, if I called him from the desk to suggest a change in his lead or some trivial fact, he would just hang up the phone and go back to what he wanted to do. And he was good enough to get away with it. And Anthony was good enough to get away with it. Part of that was, as Rami said, that he understood that the story that he wanted to cover was the real texture of life as it was experienced in the Arab world. And that meant connecting with people at a level below where news events, in quotation marks, happen. So Anthony would go out to the booksellers in Baghdad, and the street where people for a century had been talking about books and writing. He'd go find the artists and poets. Anthony had a quality that is too rare in our business, which is that he was a humble man. He never thought he was more important than the story that he was covering. He never thought he was more important than the people that he talked to. He was, it's funny, this is a rare thing in the news business, he was a good listener. He didn't interrupt to tell you what he thought, or he didn't interrupt to tell you what the story was, steer the conversation, just let people talk. And finally, he was deeply curious. He didn't accept the kind of meta-narratives that often were product of what the big editors in Washington or New York thought. He let the story emerge from his own experience in reporting and curiosity. What is it? What's going on here? And that's one reason that his stories often have a contrarian quality. They just went the other way because they express not the dominant narrative that had been put together back in America, let's say, but they express the narrative that emerged from talking to people. So I want to talk now a little bit about my own experience covering the Middle East and some things that I learned that I'm proud of, that I wish that I had more of a chance to do now, and that I'd love to see some of my colleagues who are younger and more energetic. So the Palestinian-Israeli problem existed in many ways similar form and tension in the time that I covered the Middle East. And I remember the feeling of skating around on the surface and covering statements and events, again in quotation marks, and I thought that's just not doing it. So I decided that I would try to live for a week or so in a Palestinian village, and I chose, with help from friends in Amman, the small town, agricultural town of Halhul, which is just south of Bethlehem, between Bethlehem and Hebron, on the road that many of you, I'm sure, have traveled. And I arranged to stay in the house of a stonecutter, not a fancy person, but a stonecutter named Hamadi Kashkish. He had this simple trade. His family were farmers. His old grandfather, one tooth left in his mouth, as I remember, was still with him. And so we would spend our days and nights traveling this little village and walking into people's lives. And somebody would finally show us that if she turned over a picture of one of her relatives, there was a picture of Yasser Arafat, which was illegal. Somebody else would display a little woven sort of enclosure for paper napkins, and it turned out to be a Palestinian flag, which was also illegal. And we began to learn about the sort of people. It was almost like Marquez writing about Latin America. I forgot Hajj Hassan Abu Asaba, who was supposed to have journeyed the whole length of Halhul, jumping from tree to tree and never touched the ground. People still told his story. So the real life of this place and its people living under Israeli occupation, what it felt like at 5:30 in the morning when you woke up and looked out and there were the Israeli soldiers. and what it felt like as you got ready to go to work in Israel and get on secure buses or taxis, what it felt when the searchers came around, knocking on doors and looking, what that experience was. And then finally, the sort of human triumph of surviving. The first article in that series closed, sleeping on the roof, as is common in that part of Palestine in the summertime, with Hamadi and his father and his son, and the father didn't speak any English, said in Arabic, this perfect cloudless night, all the stars above, and I said, "This is beautiful." I said, "Yes, so this is beautiful." Long time passes. This is very This is the best! Almost shouted it to the whole village. So that was a way of getting at a different level of the story. I did one other project in that same year of 1982, which is when President Reagan launched his peace plan. It was going to be the beginning of that round of aggressive American diplomacy in the Middle East. And I took a village that had been evacuated during what the Israelis called the War of Independence, Palestinians called the Nakba, in 1948. It's a village many of you have seen if you've driven the road up to Jerusalem called Lifta. If you come up that road, you look to the left, and there's this stone houses, abandoned, cascading down the hillside. And I tried to track down where everybody had gone after they fled in that war, fled in panic. And I found them in refugee camps in Ramallah, I found them other places in the West Bank, I found them in Kuwait, I found them in Saudi Arabia, I found them in London, I found them in Washington, D.C., and so was able to put together a kind of, almost a quilt that showed the story of this diaspora, all families in this place of Lifta. And then went there with one of the families. I was able to get them permission to come with me as they walked and remembered who lived here, whose uncle, lived in that house, and where did they go? And again, trying to put real human beings and real emotions behind this story. I just will note one final thing before leaving this long ago period. I went back 10 or 15 years ago to see my friend Hamadi Kashkish, the stonecutter who had been my host when I briefly lived in Al-Hol. He was an unusual man in that although he had been imprisoned as an activist, an alleged terrorist from the PFLP, and then had been released, when he was working after his release, working at a resort in the Sinai Desert, in the Negev. He had watched as an Israeli child, infant, 2 or 3, fell into the swimming pool while his parents were doing something. He was an young person there. He couldn't swim, but he jumped in anyway. And the Israeli always wondered, why did you do that? Why? And his answer was, that let this little boy die. So this is a person who didn't have intense hatred in his heart. The thing that he cared most about was the grapes that his family had. Al-Hol is a place where they grow grapes, and they think their grapes are the best in the world, period. And if you don't get into an argument because you're going to lose, they're the best grapes. And Hamadi would, when I first met him, take me to his vines, show me how he cultivated them. So when I went back to see him, you'll just have to envision this in your mind, a special road for settlers had been built between him and his grapevines. Barbed wire, impossible to pass. And we sat on his porch and watched these vines dying, withering and dying. It left an unforgettable impression on me. I wrote a column about what it's like to sit there and watch your grapes die. And at that time, even then, he still talked about the possibility of negotiations. He couldn't stand the Palestinian Authority. He thought it was completely corrupt. I mean, again, this is Stonecutter. He thought all the fat cats from Fatah strutted around the village. He couldn't stand them. But he wanted dignity and self-government for his people. I went to see him one final time, and I mentioned this just to close this discussion of what we can learn from reporting that gets under the surface. And he basically had given up hope that what he dreamed of, what had animated his leap into that swimming pool to save this young boy, the sense that we're all in this somehow together, that really had gone. It was painful to hear him say it was just not possible. And if you look at the land around Halhul, if you travel the road from Jerusalem south through Bethlehem to Hebron, you know exactly what that feels like. There's just not much land left between settlements and outposts. So I just know those points, which I know from my own experience, are the things that you can see if you step out of the things that you're supposed to do, that the assignment desk tells you should do, and do something different. Anthony was our master at this, at doing the thing that's different. But that's where you really learn something. So let me conclude with just a couple of thoughts about challenges for journalists in covering this region, why it's different now, and what I worry about as a journalist, trying to do my own coverage and trying to help others. In Beirut, when I first got there in 1980, journalists essentially carried a white flag. We described ourselves as unbiased reporters. Most of us were based in West Beirut, where the Palestinians were the dominant security presence. But we traveled to East Beirut to interview the Kataib, the Maronite Christian forces that were shelling the western side of the city. We could sneak through. Rami, I'm sure remembers this. You could slink down the car, go through the Green Line, and then you'd be on the other side, and then you go talk to people on the other side. And you could also go into the Shuf Mountains and see the Druze militia, and you could see the early Shia militias that were just forming. In other words, with your white flag, I still have credentials from every one of those militias. Pictures of David, who's 29 or whatever it was, and in every picture I need a haircut, which that was still a concern. We were welcome in every part of this fragmented country because people felt they needed us to tell their stories. It's important to talk to the Wall Street Journal, where I was from, or the New York Times or the Associated Press. So they let us travel, they let us move around, and then they protected us. They wanted to make sure we were who we said we were, but we had that white flag. Today, I don't need to tell you, people do not let us travel as freely as we did. It's still possible if you're willing to take enormous risks. We have a few colleagues, Robert Fisk, that comes to mind, who's ready to brave going into places where he doesn't know that he'll be accepted. But the firepower now is so intense, so dangerous to move around, that there's come to be a feeling that you need to be embedded with one side or another when you travel. And that has terrible negative consequences. It means you see the story not whole, not, this morning I'm in West Beirut, this evening I'm in East Beirut. You see one side of it because you're embedded with that side. And I think that's something that we in journalism initially thought we wanted. We kept saying in the Pentagon to other militaries, please let us travel. Please give us accreditation so we can cover the story from the inside of the tank or our personnel carrier. And I think we've gotten into this embedded world. I covered the 2003 invasion of Iraq, not as an embedded reporter, but on my own. And it was not easy, but I saw things you couldn't see otherwise. And the main thing I saw was, even in the first week of that war, there was an insurgency. The Americans were still surprised 6 months later. Well, if you'd been traveling behind that, as one of the TV correspondents said, this racing arc of steel moving toward Baghdad. The typical TV, if you had not been in the arc of steel, that you'd been talking to people in the towns that were what you found was there was an organized resistance. You found that because people were afraid to talk to you, they'd start talking and say, I can't got stopped over there, Abdul Hamid is, he's with Abraya style. So, I think being unembedded is crucial. Final point I want to make is about social media. Social media obviously has had a transformative effect on every part of our information lives, our connected lives, and there are many ways in which that's good. The ability of connected citizens to photograph with their phones and then upload accounts of what they're seeing and brutality that they're seeing has been a very powerful tool. But there's also a way that I think we all know in which social media has paradoxically, because it's supposed to be about connection, been a force for polarization and division. I'm still struggling to understand why that's true and what to do about it, but I know that it is true, and I see that in the Middle East. There's a way in which the internet is, I sometimes say, a rage accelerator. It just makes you more angry, and there's nothing you can do about it except write an incredibly nasty, vituperative, expletive-filled, anonymous email to some journalist or some Twitter person who has outraged you because you're so angry. And I think that's the least productive way for human beings to respond. And this technology gives us that tool. It's now very hard to write an account of, say, Mohammed bin Salman, positive or negative, without getting completely drowned in crazy messages. It shouldn't be so. It shouldn't be so. It's really important for journalists to talk to him, to do real reporting, to figure out is this what's good here, what's bad here, and not be inundated with the same obviously holds for the Israel-Palestinian issues. Even more, this has been true really, I think, for 50 years, but even more than when I was a journalist. It's very hard to write what you hope is a good piece of journalism without getting trashed. My friend Tom Friedman, who Robbie and I came up with, I think has been very courageous for many years in telling the truth about Israel and choices it faces if it continues with the policies that Netanyahu has chosen. Tom gets attacked every time he writes a column in a way, he has a strong stomach. I admire him because he keeps doing it. So that's where I want to close. The basic reality in covering the Middle East is the same as in covering the Trump administration or any administration. Journalists have to do their job. We need to, as my late boss Ben Bradley used to say, suck it up. Suck it up. We never were sure quite what you're supposed to suck up, but anyway, suck it up. And then go out and do your job. And that means basically, don't be afraid of people. Don't be afraid of physical threats or just threats, the attacks that you get. They're now part of everyday life. Hold people accountable for what they do, no matter who they are, where they are. I think in the Arab world, there hasn't been enough accountability in Arab political leaders. That's something that Rami has thought about deeply over the years and finally exploded in the Arab Spring. But in part, it was the product of so many years of neglect that people just didn't hold their leaders accountable. They were so alienated from politics. So I'd love to see this empowered Arab citizen with his phone, her phone, transformed into somebody who's about accountability, about building governance. And then I think the final thing that I'd say is what I think Anthony in his heart felt most deeply, which is in the end you work for your readers. You're accountable to your readers and to your readers not just tomorrow morning, but 10 years from now. But you'll be judged by whether you really do work that rises to the level of the story. And as we see this current chapter unfolding, there are so many challenges for young journalists, Arabs and Americans in the Arab world, and I just hope they understand it's not just tomorrow's readers, but it's Rami and I are going to be reading 10 years from now, and if you did the kind of job that Anthony did, it will be remembered.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
so much to the both of you. And just before we open it up for questions and discussion, I see a few people taking notes. I think you probably have some thoughts of things you'd like to ask these two. And Dr. Farah in Beirut, I'd like you, May, in Beirut, to introduce yourself and tell us who's sitting there and your response to what you heard Rami and David talking about through your lens as a journalist and as a teacher in the Middle East.
Okay, I just need to tell you that our video froze. It seems like the streaming is going fine. They seem to hear us and see us, so.
But we're not hearing
But we're not hearing her.
Can you hear us okay?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
We can.
Okay. Hi. Good afternoon on a dark and a bit cool Beirut final week of the semester and final day of the semester. So we have a very small crowd here, unfortunately. But with me is mostly media studies faculty and students. And I had prepared some notes, but they would take us a bit out of the way of what we've already been speaking about. And I think there are some people in the room who probably would like to make comments. And so I think I'm just going to forego my own notes and I'll leave it open to Q&A, if that's okay.
That's fine, May, thank you. And maybe you could start or have someone introduce him or herself and tell us who they are.
I think of my colleague to my right, Nabil Dejani, who is a professor of media studies, and he has probably among the longest serving faculty at AUB, certainly in our department. So I think I'm going to let him say a few words to start us, if that's okay.
That's great, thank you.
Thank you. I have just a few comments. Basically, when we're talking about foreign correspondents' role, excuse me, in this part of the world, I have been for the past 60 years working journalist, student of the media, particularly in the Arab world, and my sad impression about the role of foreign correspondents in this part of the world is that their reports miss the why in the news. They focus on the tree and not the forest. They tell us when there is a tree on fire, they rush to report about the tree, but they fail to give a picture of the forest before the tree is burned. And when the tree is burned, they just simply tend to report about why it burned, but they don't tell us about the consequence. Why did it burn? We are told that the Palestinian shot an Israeli, but they don't tell us why did the Palestinians shoot the Israeli. They tell us the Palestinians shot the Israeli, and as a consequence, the Israeli retaliated by killing so many other people. And this is the problem of correspondence in this part of the world. They fail to focus on the why, and when they focus on the why, when they give the why basically based on the why of the tree and not on the forest. Another observation I see is that now, at present, we have a tendency of focusing on the social media in getting our information. David talked about his experience with this Palestinian peasant. What is needed is that these correspondents should talk more to such people. Face-to-face interaction is extremely important. Depending on the social media is bad because it does not help you understand the real why. And so basically, my comments about the role of a color correspondent in this part of the world is that it lacks the big why and it lacks face-to-face interaction between the correspondent and the people. It lacks these correspondents often lack the knowledge of the culture to be able to explain what is happening in this part of the world. Thank you.
Is there anyone else, May?
Sure. Do you want to go around the room and collect comments, or did you want to address that particular comment, or?
I'll ask David and Rami if they would like to,
We'll get some
or
comments.
let's get some comments from your room. It's always hard to be the first one.
Yeah.
My name is Nora Bustani, and I teach journalism here at AUB, and David Ignatius used to be my foreign editor when I used to work at the Washington Post. I agree that social media is very distracting to young people trying to go into this field. But what we're trying to do, at least what I try to do in my classes, is send young journalists out to Palestinian camps, to Syrian refugee settlements, armed with certain tools that we give them on how to report on people who have been traumatized. And we use as examples before they go out series written by Anthony Shadid, by Rania Abu Zaid, who did a fantastic job in Syria, and other award-winning series. So, and what is interesting is that these students are really thirsty to do that kind of work. But whether they will have the opportunity once they graduate to have access to such areas or such jobs is another question. So I think, what we should think about going forward is, how much can newspapers afford to invest in that kind of coverage, which takes time and effort and money. And some people here, like Ayman Hanna of Skies, are suggesting that we do what BuzzFeed does and have journalists cover the, fluffy, superficial news on the one side, and then also have investigative teams go in and write about ISIS and what makes young women want to join them, etc. So balance off the quality reporting with some of the superficial reporting and journalism that people do to have an economically sustainable model to allow journalists and their owners, to afford that kind of coverage that is necessary. But I think, the willingness to want to listen to what people are saying, every journalist has that if he's given the opportunity and the time to do it. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Do we have any reaction to that here?
Is there any more questions there? Any comments? And then
Here comes someone.
One more.
Yeah, hello. My name is Tony Orr. I teach here digital media and journalism as well here at AUB. Now, just going back a little bit on the Nora's point, we can write very interesting stories about people living in villages and so on, but I think because of the way media has changed, the audience really chooses what they want to read. So I think there's a dilemma over there. It's not really about the journalists who don't know how to write good stories, it's more about what people want to read, right? So I think it's within the news organizations, they have the responsibility in terms of what people are actually reading and what is the information that they're getting. That's it.
Yeah, great. We have one more.
Hi, I'm sorry. One very quick comment. Thank you for your talks. My name is Greg Burris. I'm an assistant professor here in media studies. Very briefly, you both talked about the need for context, specifically in the case of what's taking place in Palestine and Trump's refusal to recognize the capital of Palestine as Jerusalem, is one way to put it. You said that on the one hand, we need more context with respect to where the violence began, and you said Trump's speech is where it began. And the other speaker said that context in terms of U.S. policy. And I would just say, there's a lot of different contexts we could look at. The context, to me, that seems to be ignored or covered up is the context of settler colonialist violence and the way that the Palestinian conflict is always framed as two even sides. the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as opposed to a settler colonialist entity. What are the structural barriers keeping American and Western media from talking about it in these terms? I don't think it's just a question of particular journalists not wanting to do the right thing. I think there are structural causes for this. So if you'd like to speak on that issue, I'd appreciate it.
Yes.
Should I start with a couple of comments? Okay, thank you all in Beirut. A couple of comments to Greg's point. Absolutely, that's clear. The situation is a situation of occupation and colonization and resistance. Many of us in the region have been writing about that for years, and increasingly, quality journalists in the world are explaining that, increasingly. So I remember when I was in college in the late 60s in the US, even the mentioning the word Palestinian was unusual. It wasn't talked about. Palestinians, especially before the 67 war, the issue of Palestine just didn't exist. And then after 67, it became a little bit more in the news. And then since then, we've had a significant change in some reporting by some quality media, which is unprecedented. So you'll get big series about settler extremism, about violence by right-wing Zionists, by all kinds of terrible things the Israelis do, or the impact of pro-Israel lobby groups in the US, whether they're Christian or anything else. These things never existed before in the American media. They do now, but they're very episodic. The overall tendency is still a problematic one, which is similar to what Nabil described and what all of us have lived with, which is the overall tendency, especially when you get a 1-minute news report on a cable news network or on an FM radio station, where they don't have the space or the time to give context, so they just say violence broke out in the West Bank and Palestinians shelled Israel from Gaza, without any of the context. So this is the dilemma, that the overall context is still skewed to keeping the Palestinians and their cause and broad Arab causes. It's not just the Palestinians, there's 400 million Arabs, and none of them, except for some Tunisians, have real civic rights or political rights. None of them, except Tunisians, can really practice some kind of credible political accountability of their own leaders. And we're seeing it now with the Arab leaderships all over the region just issuing formulaic criticism of the US policy on Jerusalem, but not really doing anything else. And average Arab citizens are terribly stressed and frustrated and dehumanized by the situation, that not only are they degraded by what's going on, they're also degraded by the inaction of their own leaderships, particularly the Palestinians, but all the Arab world, and they're degraded by the Israeli continuing colonization and Western governments' inability to do anything. So in this context, the issue of trying to explain that human reality strikes me as the critical, and that's one of the things I try to do in my columns and my analysis and collecting data, is to try to show why ordinary people are so angry and why the uprisings happened and why people continue to struggle against these dominant trends, but without really being able to achieve any success. And the frustrations continue to mount. So we don't know what's going to happen. But I think it's clear that what we're dealing with in the Arab world, and the uprisings of 7 years ago were the most powerful testament to this, that there is now mass discontent and stress all across the Arab world, probably covering 60 to 70% of Arab families that can barely make ends meet at the end of every month. And these people have no rights and no capacity to improve their situation, while Arab leaderships, the Israeli government, the American government, and others continue to do things that degrade them. So that's the challenge, I think, for journalism in the region and abroad, which is how do we describe this situation without sounding like a bunch of radical lefty activists, militants or something. I mean, this is a human reality. So again, I take you back to Ferguson, Missouri. How do you deal with Ferguson? How do you deal with the situation of migrant labor in the southwest of the US, living in stressful conditions. These are human realities that are very complex, but they are essentially great news stories, and they're important news stories, and they need to be analyzed in their totality. My impression is that the mainstream media in the US, and certainly in Europe, is better now than it was 40 years ago, but it's still not even-handed, clearly. There's still a bias. But that change, you see it happening across American society. If you look at mainstream churches, if you look at labor unions, if you look at academia, if you look at student groups, you see, and polling is clearly showing this. Shibli Telhami at the University of Maryland released a poll 4 days ago, which was extraordinary, showing American public opinion on Trump and the Middle East. And it showed that something like 60%, 65% or something of the American public wants the United States to be even-handed, to help Israelis and Palestinians live a decent, normal life in sovereign, secure states. That was clear. The American public's attitude has clearly become more reasonable. The media is slowly following, but still very slowly, not enough. And this is, I think, our challenge, both as journalists and as educators in the Middle East and here. And I think one of the unique challenges of AUB, because we transcend these worlds, is how do we bring this reality and share it with our colleagues in the United States, in education and in the media, for both of our benefits. And so these are, I think, the points that are made in Beirut are all very accurate and very correct, and they just highlight the challenges that we're all trying to grapple with. And my experience is that when Americans and Arabs or Europeans and Middle Easterners or any combination of people in different cultures, when they get together to discuss and analyze an issue like this, they're going to get better results than if they try to do it on their own. And that's why it's so critical to get this kind of interaction and others that we hope will follow between AUB and institutions in the US of education, of civic society and others to look at these issues and perhaps get to the point of doing joint courses, joint workshops, joint summer institutes that let us analyze these issues more completely and then interact more deeply with the media itself, with the people who are actually producing the news and the views. David.
Let me try to answer each of the questions that was raised in Beirut, because they were all good ones. First, to Nabil's question about the why, the need to focus more on the why. I agree with that. The why takes you into a very subjective area. Sometimes that's something that journalists can do as news analysis, should do as news analysis. But I think, we're in a world where commentary matters, and that's precisely what people in my business should do, is get at the why. You made a comment about the importance of face-to-face interaction as opposed to social media. And one thing that I noticed during the Syrian civil war, when it was so dangerous for journalists to cover that on the ground, was the increasing dependence on social media. The war was basically reported out of Beirut using information collected from social media by various groups in Beirut, and that certainly was better than having no information. But it was often skewed. I think are not really seeing the Syrian war clearly has been one of the contributed to that nightmare. And it's just hard to know what the answer to that is. I tried sneaking into Syria in 2012, went to Aleppo. I learned some things from that were invaluable for me. But that was around the time that my colleague Jim Foley, in a very similar place, was kidnapped and ended up being killed by ISIS. So I think this is a problem that people in our business have to think more about. How are we going to do this? How are we going to be more confident about the social media feeds that we get, that they're reliable? To take Nora's comments, the first thing I want to say is that Nora Bosani, who I edited as foreign editor, is one of the models, like Anthony Shadid, of what good journalists can do. I don't know that I've ever seen a war correspondent braver than Nora, or ever seen a correspondent who was better able than Nora at getting people to just, I used to say, bleed on the page. I mean, just express their raw emotions, what they were living through, and Nora would capture it in their notebook. At the risk of embarrassing or infuriating Nora, I'm gonna remember one of the things that haunts me. In 1991, after the Iraqis had been driven from Kuwait, we remember that there was an uprising in the south, and Nora would go up from Kuwait City, leaving early morning, get to Karbala, get to the areas where this fighting was taking place, and then try to get back at night in time to file. And it was too difficult and dangerous, and we couldn't sustain that presence. I've always thought, looking back, Nora, I'd be interested in your comments, that if we found a way to do that so that we had a presence on the ground, that the way that story turned out would have been different. That the feeling that the Shia uprising had, that they'd been abandoned by America, wouldn't have been the same, that there would have been pressure on Washington to do something to support these people. This whole story might have been different. Let me finish, and I'd love if Nora can come back and comment on that. If your name is Antonia, that's the way I heard it. If I got that, so sorry. You're right that the audience chooses what it wants to read, and the truth is a sort of long, sentimental, maybe turgid story about living in a Palestinian village isn't going to get all that many clicks today. We live in the clickbait world, it's really a struggle to know how to deal with that. That's a reality that we all know. People vote with their clicks for the journalism that they actually want to read, and what we see is that it's the most inflammatory words and images that seem to get the most traction in social media. I mean, if you got some outrageous, crazy thing, I mean, maybe exactly the thing people should see. So some act of terrible cruelty somewhere in the Middle East is captured, but this process tends to drive things toward extremes, away from a kind of common platform of fact, and we see the consequences of that. Finally, on Greg's question, should we see this more in terms of the Arab narrative, that this is about resistance to illegal settlement and colonialism? My own feeling about the Middle East is that news organizations have a responsibility to see the world they're covering whole. And that means that covering the Israel part about it, covering the Arab part about it, not to be submerged in any one narrative, but to in a sense explain them, but also challenge them at every point. So, I think we need to do a better job of explaining settler presence, settler violence, settler intolerance. Israelis often say to me, and I think it's a reasonable point, why don't Arab journalists do more to cover their world? Why are we the ones who point up kind of intolerant ideas that people are taught, acts of violence that are in some cases gratuitous, not provoked? Why are we the only ones covering that? Why shouldn't you cover that if you're a journalist? And I have to say, I think that's a fair point. That Arab journalists want to hold the Arab world accountable for corruption, for good government, for adhering to the norms that we cherish. So that'd be one retort. I'm not disagreeing with you that we need to cover the settler presence and the abuses that are there, but I think in a world where you see the world whole, there'd be some more dimensions too.
I wonder if in this room we have a few comments or questions. I'm especially interested in those of you who are students of journalism at the moment. Oh, yes.
Yeah, I worked in television news in that part of the world, and I agree with everything you say, but I want to know what you assess the television coverage of what's going on now.
The television coverage of what's going on now in Jerusalem?
Yes, or in that part of the world.
Well, I've only seen a little bit here in the U.S. in the last 36 hours, but when I've seen cable news and I've turned on to the main networks, NBC and ABC and those, and I must say I've been very disappointed. It's been rather formulaic, with one or two exceptions only. You're getting coverage that reflects what the mainstream media anticipates as being dramatic and newsy. So if you just look at the way to analyze TV, for me, one way, is to turn on the TV and turn off the volume, put it on mute. Just what is the image that's coming out? And when I did that last night, I listened to some and muted others. The images are just smoke and tear gas and Palestinian kids and people shooting back at firing at each other or something. And this only tells you what happened yesterday, and it doesn't tell you about the wider context. It doesn't tell you about the United States president deciding to make the United States an intellectual outlaw in the world today on the issue of the sovereignty in Jerusalem, for instance. So it doesn't tell you this deeper issue, what Greg and Nabil and others were talking about. So TV news by nature is an entertainment medium. If you look at the print coverage, if you look at some of the websites, the beauty today is you have alternatives. If you're really interested in this, you can go to all kinds of websites and you can get this stuff sent to your inbox. You don't have to go searching for it anymore. So the options for good coverage are there for the viewers, for the readers. So there's a lot of better coverage going on that gives different viewpoints. But I would say the mainstream media coverage, even the mainstream quality press, is still a little bit skewed and formulaic because it basically is covering the same story as 1988 and 1990, which is Palestinians demonstrating in the streets and using violence and creating turmoil in the Arab world, which is not a real story. That's just one angle of a much deeper issue. So we have to address this, figure out how do we deal with this issue as journalists and as educators, and how can we work and do something to try to improve it by interacting with American journalists more. And this is one of the things we hope to do at AUB, is to maybe have some seminars here in the United States with quality journalism schools like NYU and Columbia and others, and get together with educators here, but also with working journalists. And I've started making contacts already to get more people like David and others, so we can have workshops, seminars, and talk through these issues on the basis of scientific evidence. And this is again where AUB is fascinating. So we have people who do studies, who do scientific studies, and bring evidence to the table. So here's the coverage. And other people do this here in the United States all the time. So we have to work at this. It's still a problem. Entertainment media want to give you shots of people running in the streets. That's what they want. And that's what brings viewers. Now, just one last point to slightly contradict that. The evidence from 9/11, I remember. I was in the U.S. when 9/11 happened. The evidence from 9/11, I remember talking to NPR editors, and their donations tripled overnight in the United States because they were giving quality, in-depth, serious analysis of why 9/11 happened, while much of the mainstream media wasn't. But NPR was, and there was huge demand among viewers. We've seen recently the New York Times and the Washington Post have doubled and tripled their digital viewers, people paying money, $100 a year or whatever, to get quality compared to the rest of the American news. So the quality news, there is a demand for it. The readers are willing to pay for it. And this is an important business issue. And keep in mind that these are business commercial operations. Their main bottom line goal is to sell advertising. And they sell advertising by getting audiences. And they get audiences by giving the audiences stuff that the audiences want. And this is a constant dilemma we all deal with. But what we're seeing is that there is a big audience for quality coverage. And we have to figure out how to keep working with that.
Rami, do you see a difference between European news and American news in terms of television? Because I spend a lot of time watching the French 24/7, Euronews, BBC, etc. They seem to cover context. They seem to have the debate, for example, on the French channel. PBS in this country, Judy Woodruff, often has opposing sides to an issue, which is very nicely done, without screaming, without a lot of blah.
Right. Definitely there's a difference. European news, France 24, Deutsche Welle and others, BBC to a large extent. BBC still leans a little bit to its Anglo-American heritage, so it still has a bit of its own weaknesses, but generally it's very good. But the Europeans definitely, they give more in-depth analysis and interviews and less spot, 2-minute stories.
Right.
I just would make one comment about TV coverage, which is that I've seen some outstanding coverage by Arabic news channels who send journalists into Syria and Iraq into some pretty hairy places. There's a woman named Janan Musa, whose work I especially admire, who has broken just a ton of stories. I was in Syria, just outside of Raqqa, in July, and who blows in the door but Janan Musa. And she, there's some journalists for Al Jazeera who I think did an outstanding job trying to cover Syria. Same with Al Arabiya. So I think one thing I really believe in, just to say to all of the journalism students and teachers gathered around both tables, is our seeing our business as a global collectivity in which we hold each other to common standards of coverage, accuracy, independence, to the extent possible, fairness, and in which we praise outstanding work that may be hard to see, but really is worth celebrating. I think if there was more of that interdependence, where we gathered around a common table online or in person and held each other accountable, we'd be better able to resist the pressures from governments who want to set the rules, and not just governments, crazy hysterical audiences who want to tell us what the right is. So I think we, standing apart and sort of linking arms as professionals, I think that'd be really good for us. Maybe AUB could do that in conjunction. I'm serious, in conjunction with some American organizations.
Absolutely.
We have about 8 minutes left, and I think we have a question over here. Yes.
Thank you. I'm Anissa Mehdi. I got my degree from Columbia when you were living in Kabul. In the journalism degree, that is. I'd like to bring us back to the question you started, which was Mr. Trump's declaration yesterday of recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of the State of Israel. And, the United States did that in 1995 after Oslo with the Jerusalem Embassy Act, which has a waiver that Trump did sign, just as every president has signed since '95, saying, we'll think about it for 6 months before we take any action. And I haven't seen any coverage of that, talk about the nuances of the story. So we have a president who says lots of things and often changes his mind. And I'm interested in your view on any critique, deep reporting, what's missing in the coverage that has resulted in the rage, but without any context.
I'll just make a brief comment on that. I think the Trump administration hasn't been able to make up its mind whether its explanation of this is it's a decisive act that takes Jerusalem off the table quite properly, or it's not a serious act because we didn't actually move the embassy yet and you're paying too much. I think they need to decide whether they think it's a really big deal, fundamentally important or not so important. I'm getting big time mixed messages from them about the importance of it. I think it's hard. In my judgment, it is important. Yes, that act was passed in '95. It was an act of Congress. President's executive branches have systematically not followed it for very specific reasons involving the U.S. ability to be seen as a convener, broker of peace talks, and that's the flashing yellow, if not red light, that Trump just sailed through, in my judgment.
I would add just two things. Congress on the Arab-Israeli issue does not reflect the opinion of the American public. That's clear. We know that scientifically proven for many years. So the American people are much more even-handed, much more balanced. They want the U.S. to engage in promoting a peace agreement that's fair to everybody and anchored in international law and UN resolutions. The American Congress does not do that. The American Congress is heavily, structurally, chromosomally, almost politically chromosomally tilted to Israel. So when it votes 100-0 to support Israel during the war in Gaza and things like that, so I wouldn't take the position of the U.S. Congress on Israel-Palestine stuff as representing really American policy. It represents congressional political self-interest, which takes us to the Trump decision. The question we have to ask, which I wrote about in my column, how much of this is based on domestic political and funding of election campaign matters? How much of it is based on an attempt, maybe an amateurish attempt by the Trump administration to try to actually promote an Israeli-Palestinian negotiation, which clearly this isn't going to do? How much of it is based on Jared Kushner's attempt to try to bring about big new things in the Middle East, most of which have been amateurish so far and unsuccessful? We just don't know the answer to these questions. So there's about 4 or 5 different drivers of Trump policy in the Middle East. Most of them have been contradictory and keep evolving so far. It's very hard to make an accurate, clear statement about what Trump administration policy is in the Arab-Israeli conflict or in the wider Middle East. So I think these questions will be answered in due course.
Oh, and certainly in 6 months.
Yeah, certainly.
In 6 months.
Well, possibly, we'll see. And the fact that
something has to be said in 6 months.
Yeah, well, we'll see. The fact that this keeps being deferred is an important indicator that there are clear, strong views in the American political decision-making structure in Washington that moving the embassy to Jerusalem is not in America's national interest right now. They keep deferring it. So this is something for the political system to decide. If the system then decides in 6 months, look, we got to make this move, well, then the question is, so what's going to happen? What political reaction will there be? Will there be any political reaction? This is the dilemma on the Arab side. People don't know how to respond to this. But again, we can't predict. So I think journalists should stay out of the business of future predictions and just look at what are the realities on the ground and try to understand what drives decision-making, but also what drives popular sentiment. Because in the end, it's popular emotions in the United States, in the Middle East, that will push the politicians to make their decisions.
I think we have 2 questions here, and I think Dr. Farah also wanted to make a comment. Can we
That's correct,
just
yes.
let her?
Go ahead, Dr. Farah.
Yes, I do, but I also just gonna let Nora make her comment. She's been waiting longer.
Okay.
We've kind of digressed a little bit from what we should do to improve our craft. And I think the point everybody made about David made about collaborating between local journalists and American journalists, that's kind of already happening. All these journalists have fixers. But also the point that Nabil made about knowing the culture of a place, that's very important. To go back to the Shiite uprising in Iraq that you mentioned, David, I remember that day we were traveling some 300, 500 miles from the Kuwaiti border, and I suddenly noticed that there were trucks and vans and bicycles and cars full of people with mattresses and pots and pans and children. And I was driving up with Bob Drogan from the LA Times, and I said, we've got to stop. Something is happening to these people. They're fleeing. And he looked at me and he said, don't they always travel like that? And I said, no. I know these scenes from South Lebanon when people used to flee Israeli air raids. And sure enough, we kind of set up our own barricade and started debriefing these villagers, village after village, family after family, reconstructed how Saddam had cracked down on Shiite villagers who had risen up against the Ba'ath officials in their locales. And, maybe it was too late to change the course of what was happening, but just the ability to pick up on how people react under stress or in certain situations, I think helped change the conversation that was going on in Washington then. And as you said, David, maybe it was too late. If we had had correspondents in those places, maybe the coverage would have come sooner and some lives would have been spared. But I think I always tell my students that before they go somewhere, they have to read up on it and learn a little bit about the culture. I think, the gold standard is the way National Geographic kind of covers stories through an anthropological, historical, contextual approach. And we can't do that in daily journalism, but we can strive to. I won't take any more time.
If I could just add a point or two. We touched on it a little bit about as well, like we live in like a social media age where people are bombarded with information daily from all points. And for a lot of our students, they get a lot of this information, they read a lot of this information, and it's very difficult to separate fact from fiction. And so they're bombarded with this information. And I think part of what we here as educators do, and what I think is really wonderful and unique about our program is that it is a media studies program, and in it we also have practice-based courses. And so we hope we're teaching these students how to, a craft, how to write, how to broadcast, multimedia, to function in a multimedia environment. But we're also, and I think equally importantly, teaching them how to consume media critically. And that is to look at media that they, are bombarded with on a daily basis, and to critically assess this media that they're watching, they're listening, they're reading to. And hopefully by making them better consumers of media, we also make them better producers of media. And I think that's something that we here in our program, are striving for. And so that, when we send our students out in the world, they're, much more critical and much more kind of see the world through a lens in which kind of they then will be able to contribute, better stories.
If you don't have more, I know we have 2 questions in this room. We've been given the go-ahead to do a few more minutes. And can we take you and then you?
My name is Rami Shadi. I'm from the United Nations. Just a couple of observations on the current coverage of the Israel-Palestine issue, Jerusalem issue. And then maybe another point on the freedom of press in the Middle East in general, and Al Jazeera in particular. With whatever happened with Mohammed bin Salman and all of that. On the first point, and I think it's both addressing the point of providing the context and the background, and how the coverage is being portrayed, the images of Palestinians throwing stones. And I would actually say it's slightly more dangerous than that. The fact that now, that 1 or 2 minute segments that you see on BBC or on CNN or cable news is not addressing the 1995 and the history of this legislation, which I'll get to in a second, but it's actually now they're actually bringing counter-terror experts to talk about how this and how the Arabs are all sort of, genetically oriented to become terrorists. So it's no longer about the issue and discussing the decision and the foreign policy failure, but more about how this violence is going to lead towards people who are predetermined to become terrorists. And that is very worrying to me, beyond the actual coverage of what the story is. 1995 was the heydays of the Oslo peace process. And that's when that law was passed. It was pushed by AIPAC in the US. It wasn't pushed by the Israeli government at that stage. It was Rabin and Peres who were engaging with Arafat in the process. It was, it was an American issued passed legislation. And to me, the fact that the history of that legislation is not being addressed, that's not subjective. Those are facts. And that may reflect some also an aspect of laziness by journalists, that they're actually not going there. So I just wanted to sort of, point out these very might be controversial points in this debate. The other point is I didn't see much coverage here in the US about, again, the Saudi decision when they were boycotting, when they decided to impose a siege on Qatar, etc., and including Al Jazeera. I thought you were extremely brave from the first day you were at, speaking extremely critically, but you knew what that meant and how that violates the freedom of press and freedom of speech. And yet that wasn't covered here. People went out of their way, including I think at some point Thomas Friedman, to try to justify the policies of MBS. And I thought that was a bit problematic. I have nothing against them. I mean, this is not about sort of an exercise position, but the fact that fellow journalists were not as vocal and as critical of the decision to try, as a sovereign, trying to tell another country to shut down their press. Well, we're seeing it in the US, obviously, with Trump as well. But just a couple of comments.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can we take another question here, please?
I'm Yasmin. I'm a NYU master's student in Middle Eastern Studies. I just wanted to respond to an earlier comment made by David regarding settler colonialism. So I don't think it's a matter of just covering individual acts of violence or, as you said, intolerance by Israeli settlers, but more of journalists addressing the question of power and recognizing that settler colonialism and the national oppression of Palestinian people is a systemic and institutional problem and project. And I surely don't think that recognizing those things keeps one from viewing and analyzing the world as whole. So that's just a short comment I wanted to make.
If we have time.
Yeah.
Actually, I wanted to pick up on that point. And also just from the perspective of what we should be doing as journalists. And I think to Donnie's point, I think there is a huge appetite among audiences for meaningful coverage. And I think that all of the kind of shallow clickbait stuff aside, what people are looking for is, journalism that fully follows like the implications of the stories that they're uncovering. I think The Intercept, for example, is a good example of a media outlet that remembers that journalists are supposed to be adversarial to power, and to call. I mean, I think the idea that audiences are crazy and hysterical, even if that's only in a certain contexts, like talking about social media, is actually exactly the problem, because we work for the audiences. And I think that, while linking arms in terms of solidarity between journalists in an industry is critical, sometimes I wish that journalists like Thomas Friedman would listen to the critiques that they get more. And I think the fact that he is seemingly insulated from that is a testament to maybe some of the disconnect between a lot of journalism and the people that they're meant to serve.
A couple of quick closing comments, and just to answer a comment on these the important points. My experience for, again, 50 years, writing about Middle Eastern, very sensitive issues, obviously, in the world, Arab-Israeli stuff, Arab people and Arab regimes, big sticker items, Iran and whatever. My experience has been that we can write about all of these issues, the colonial settler reality, which I believe Israel is a colonial settler entity, and the Palestinians and other Arabs are suffering from it. But if I'm going to write about this in the Western press or talk on television, which I do regularly, what I find is critical is to separate my personal views from my reporter's job or even my analyst's job. So what I will say is, here is why Arabs, Jordanians, Palestinians, Moroccans believe that Israel is a colonial settler, dangerous enterprise, and we need to resist it, and why they see their work as, their reaction as resistance. This is how they see it. Even I agree with that, but so I don't blanket say this is colonial settlers, I say this is how Arabs see it, and they suffer from it, and here's why, and let them speak for themselves. When I wrote about the siege of Qatar by the Saudis, Emiratis, and a few other countries, I went out of my way to call friends in the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia to really understand why they do this. You know, I disagreed completely with what they did, but I needed to understand it. And I did a column for Jazeera on exactly why the Emiratis and Saudis did what they did to Qatar. And I presented that knowledge faithfully and accurately, and then I said why I disagree with it as a columnist. So I think we have to recognize there's different kinds of journalism. So what we do as columnists is slightly different than what a straight news reporter does. It's different from what an investigative in-depth reporter does, and it's different from what a TV 90-second news story reporter does. And all of these things have different realities that shape them. So the complexity of this journalism world, and when you throw in the social media, of course, everything gets much more complex. But in the final analysis, the core criteria, the core issues are get the facts, make sure they're accurate, put it in a comprehensive context that's fair to everybody, and make it meaningful to your reader, and if you can make it fun, that's even better. And talking of fun, I want to end by asking David a question. David, you are
Promise this is going to be fun.
You're a respected columnist. I'm not going to talk about the Redskins. I'm going to talk about you're a respected columnist, successful columnist, and a successful novelist. So we have to do another plug. This is like being on a morning Joe. This is so your experience as a novelist and your experience as a political columnist and analyst. How do you judge the different ways in which you actually can reach people with your views? Because in the end, you're giving us a view of some sort. So how do you compare these two?
Well, I love that last question. I'm going to save it until last and just briefly comment on the other remarks. First, Ramesh's comment. You're absolutely right that the Middle East increasingly is treated as a counterterrorism problem. And those are the analysts who are called on to comment on things that may have very little to do with terrorism in the usual sense. And I think that's one of many mistakes. There's a serious counterterrorism danger from the United States, Europe, the whole world. I mean, can't minimize that. But the idea that, okay, it's a Middle East story, let's get this former general, there is too much to that. On Qatar and Saudi Arabia's assault on Al Jazeera, I actually think there was quite a lot of media criticism of Saudi overreach. I certainly wrote several columns about it. Saudi and UAE overreach, because I think this was driven by the UAE as much as anybody. That's a point I've kept making, but I think that's widely shared, so I just disagree with you about that. On the question of settler colonialism, I need to be honest and say that colonialism is not a word that I'm comfortable with using. It's not for me a journalistic word. There are people on the right who write about Islamofascism. That's a phrase it drives me crazy because it has resonance to another time, another set of issues. It doesn't seem to me to be useful in talking about real issues. Now, I just have the same feeling about colonialism. I understand the arguments that one would make, so I do think that the deeper issue that you raise, quite apart from what words you apply, is there a systemic component to this violence? Is there a process at work here in which the United States is involved, is complicit, that keeps producing these outcomes? I think that's entirely legitimate. I think we do some reporting on that. We should do more. I remember one column I did a few years ago about tax-exempt, U.S. tax-exempt contributions that ended up being for the supportive settlement side. Very courageous Israeli-American woman who's devoted herself to this, dug up powerful, looking at all the tax returns and things. So I think being able to flesh out that idea with real evidence, so you say, look, there's a systemic process, here's what it is, here's how it works, here's what the outcomes are, I agree with. Tom, I don't think Tom is insulated from criticism. Tom chooses to continue to write what he thinks is right, knowing that he gets believing. Tom not unaware that he's being criticized. I want journalists to say what they think and not be afraid. And I mean that in every sense, not be afraid of being unpopular, with one particular group. I mean, it shouldn't be that if you write something favorable about Mohammed bin Salman, people say you're a Saudi propagandist and, where's your check, and things like that. I mean, people can have different opinions of things. And the right response is to take on the specific arguments about how Saudi Arabia is or is not changing under Mohammed bin Salman, about, the name-calling part, I don't think serves it. Finally, on this question that as I said, I love the briefest answer. It's wonderful to have the opportunity to be a storyteller to media. The difference between my journalism, now commentary, and my fiction is that in my columns I have 750 words. If I push it, I have 760, but I don't have 770 to cut it back. So it's tightly constrained. And each column has to end with a prescriptive little nugget. And so, what you should think about this is such and such. So it's reductionist by definition. It takes complex problems, the nuances that interest me just because of the way I am, I have to chuck out mostly. A novel allows you to just describe something the way it is, with all the complexity, all the contradictions. You can write about the view of the Israeli settler with all the passion that person feels living in Hebron. You can write about the Palestinian who lives next door to that person who's systematically, and you're just telling the story, and you're not telling the reader what to think about it. You let the reader make up his or her own mind. I love that because you let life be faithful to its complexity. And I don't like fiction that's too dogmatic and programmatic. So, I have friends who say to me, David, the only time you really tell the truth is in your fiction. I don't know what to make of that, but I do know there's a kind of truth that doesn't end with a, and so you should do, it's not programmatic. That Rami, I have not. It's hard to escape that obligation if you've got to slice the world into 750 word slices.
Yes? Yes. I'd like to thank you all. Please feel free to stay and find the person in the room you wish you had talked to, and help yourself to more food. And May and your colleagues, thank you so much for being with us. We really appreciate it and hope that this group might be able to connect again. Maybe even student to student would be pretty wonderful. All right, thank you all.
Thank you.
I'm gonna sneak out and run right to the
Turn off the mic.
Nice to see you.